So, actually, make sure my stuff is recording. Alright, it looks good. The page. Okay. Great. Okay. So for you online folks, I'm getting the test graded, like I actually graded a few right before class. So I'll try to get those graded as soon as I can. Then I've got a mess of. Well, no, they're not done until the weekend, so I can wait on that. You guys here, you got your test back. If you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, doing pretty good so far. And based on the online ones I've graded so far, doing okay so far. But I do always like to mention that if you're not happy with a grade, it can be dropped. I do drop a single grade each semester, but you got to make sure that you do both your papers in that regard, because the papers are equivalent to tests in terms of how I do the grades. But that said, if you do really good on your tests and you want to skip a paper, that's fine. I'll just drop that. And for those of you that haven't had my class before, I would suggest waiting on the second paper for that, because that's when things get really busy. But otherwise, yeah, any questions from you guys? No? Okay. Well, we finished chapter 4 last time, actually. Compared to Greece, we're actually moving along at a pretty decent clip. So we've finished with late Roman Empire, late Roman Republic, with the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, and we are now going to move into the start of the empire. So, really, the creation of the empire, and from that point forward. So, by 156, Rome pretty much had control of the entire Mediterranean. Carthage had been destroyed. Greece was Romans. It was a Roman see, or often, actually, we won't get to it today, but I'll try and pull up videos for Caligula and Nero. They called it sometimes the Roman lake, since they had control of the whole thing. So this, of course, brought them lots of money and, of course, peace, because they weren't fighting Carthage anymore, and the Hellenistic kingdoms fell pretty quick. However, this strained what made the Roman Republic the Roman Republic. All this wealth and exposure to exotic customs created greed and corruption, and peace is actually not a good thing for a society that builds most of their well-being, I shouldn't say well-being, their self-worth on warfare. So now it's like, well, what do we do? We've conquered everybody that there is to conquer. I mean, again, we do have like the Gauls and the Germans up to the north, but even that compared to like the Punic Wars was real minor. And another major thing, which I briefly alluded to last time, was just that Rome was getting so darn big, it was really difficult to govern so much land with a republic-style government. Because, well, with Rome, the city, and then its really early conquest, you could still travel physically to Rome and be in the assembly or the Senate or whatever. But when you've got this, it's hard to have a representative democracy, well, not democracy, representative republic, for all of this. I mean, it's hard to have people from, Egypt or Spain or way over here in Asia Minor to come to Rome to be part of the Assembly or the Senate. And due to how they did it number-wise, it would have been impossible even if they could travel to Rome without any issues because there would be too many people. Now, granted, as you can see, this is the Roman Empire, and it's just showing like how the provinces and senatorial imperial provinces were split up. But this is the basic idea of like how big Rome would get. Right now, we're still kind of in this pink area, but it is still like most of the Mediterranean, and then they gradually expand. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So, as I said, this stability was seen as not necessarily being a good thing in Rome. And if you wanted to, rise to the ranks in the Roman Republic, you needed to serve as a civil servant. But there weren't that many. Now, again, you don't need to know all these. This is just showing you how few there are. 20 quaestors, magistrates, 10 tribunes, which are, the tribunes were like the higher ranking members of the assembly. Again, don't worry. Well, we're going to mention tribune a little bit later, but again, the three main you need to know are the consul, senate, and assembly. The aediles, there were 4 of them. The praetors, there were 8 of them. And then, of course, the consuls, the highest office in the land, there was only 2. Now, granted, most of these had relatively short offices. The consul, you only could be in office for a year, technically. I'll get to that, too. But that's still not very many people. That's, 40-ish people? 5, 6? That's not a lot of people for again, not quite an empire, but a republic the size of Rome.
44.
Yeah, that's not a lot. Oh, yes, 8, 9, 10. Yep. Not a lot. So the patricians, the aristocracy in Rome, which is to say typically the senators, began fighting for what power was left. They had bitter rivalries, alliances. As I mentioned with clientage before, they used that to corrupt the system because if you could make 50, 60, 100 people in, say, the assembly your clients, then they'll vote with you. It would be like if, say, in America, the House of Representatives rely on the senators to pay their bills. So the House of Representatives would always vote with their senator, which, I mean, granted, with party lines and all that, that's not that uncommon, but this would be like really specific. Joe whoever from Virginia would basically be blackmailing the representatives from his state to vote with him with this clientage system. Also, the public offices didn't pay. You were doing this for the good of Rome. Now, of course, this was one of the few ways to get glory and be seen as, greater than you were when you're not going to war. But the idea was that if you're not getting paid in these service positions, you're doing it for the love of Rome, not to get rich. So they used the public positions to get rich by changing laws to benefit themselves. Boy, glad that's not a thing anymore. So again, we've got the the ladder here of how this was set up. Again, you don't need to know all these, mostly just the consoles, or sometimes the dictator, which we'll also get to that. We've mentioned the dictators already. And then you've got the various things down here, but the main thing is the plebeians over here with their, not the tribune, the assembly, and the patricians with the Senate, and then both leading up into the consuls, again, on paper at least. So this next section, we'll just go ahead and get to it. It's a lot of text, but I mean, it's two dudes that are really important in how things are going to be going forward. So let me try and condense it for you. So there were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and apparently the Latin for plural of Gracchus is Gracchi. That's why it's the Gracchi brothers. So they saw a slave revolt in, also they were descendants of Scipio Africanus, which is a big deal because if you remember, he was the one that defeated Hannibal. Therefore, his whole family is now super important. So these guys are descendants of this guy. And his family before him were also important. So like this is a major line in Rome. So they saw a slave revolt in Sicily, which for them was a problem not because, hey, there's a bunch of slaves and there was enough of them that they were able to revolt and like cause a big problem. It was our slavery system is putting poor farmers out of work, which I mean was also a thing that was happening. Small farmers were out of work, could not compete with the larger plantations known as latifundii. That's not a Latin word you guys need to know for this one. I just wanted to include that. So a lot of people were landless and therefore had no source of income, including the soldiers that went off to fight for Rome. Because again, while Carthage is destroyed and Greece is no longer an issue, there is still some level of constant warfare, again, with like the Gauls and the Germans up to the north. But if you went and fought for Rome, you'd come back and your farm would be bought up by some big landowner and you would now have no source of income. And with the Republic being as big as it was, many soldiers, instead of going out and doing warfare, would just garrison places way off from Rome. And it just felt very against what the Roman Republic had been about. They were no longer like enjoying the fruits of the Roman Republic. They were instead out in the middle of nowhere garrisoning a place for this huge government that also took their land. So Tiberius became a tribune, which again, you only need to know this because that's like a higher ranking member of the assembly. He pushed a land reform bill that would basically carve up the plantations and give the landless soldiers some land to come back to. Because again, when you go off and fight for your country, you want to have something to come back to. Many senators opposed this because they were the ones with the big plantations, and they would have lost out on some amount of power. Convinced another tribune to veto the bill, so Tiberius appealed to the assembly to get another tribune to vote on an even stronger bill. Long story short, he's pushing for a land reform bill for the soldiers, and the Senate doesn't like that. So the bill passed, but the Senate, being the Senate, was like, okay, cool, you can have your bill, but we're going to take all the money from it, because they could. So Tiberius decided he was going to be a tribune again, which apparently wasn't something that you could do. In response to him attempting to run for tribune again, a mob whipped up by the Senate hunted him down and killed him and 300 of his supporters. But the Senate still passed the bill. So, like, it was enough that Tiberius and his followers were killed, but there was so much support behind it that the Senate had to pass the bill anyway. So here's Tiberius and his followers getting beat to death. Like the book specifically mentions that they were bludgeoned, so they didn't even get stabbed, which would have been an easier way to go. Also, for some reason, when I was looking up a picture of Tiberius Gracchus, this was the first image that came up, and I had to include it. So here's Tiberius Gracchus. I guess, despite being beaten to death, his bill still got passed. So I guess that's what that's about. Anyway. So that's Tiberius. His brother, Gaius, waited 10 years after his brother was killed before making a move. Gaius was even more radical than Tiberius, became a tribune, pushed for land reforms, and wanted to try to weaken senatorial powers, because as we've seen, the Senate is basically running things at this point. Wanted his soldiers to be outfitted at the Republic's expense, colonies to be placed in places like Carthage, free grain for the citizens of Rome, work with the equestrians, who were a noble class below the patricians, but higher than, the plebeians. Suggested full Roman citizenship for Latin allies, which would, again, further reduce the power of the nobles. Because if you've got more people made citizens, then you've got more representatives in the Assembly and the Senate, which means that the people who are already in the Senate now have less power because there's more power spread among more people. Or the same amount of power spread among more people. So Gaius was a tribune twice, and then tried to secure a third term, which, again, if you recall from just the slide a minute ago, his brother trying to run for a second term resulted in him being killed, whereas Gaius apparently successfully ran a second time and then tried to go for a third. The Senate started undoing his work. His supporters turned violent, to the point that a consul declared martial law. 3,000 of Gaius' supporters were killed, and Gaius' head was presented to the Senate to collect on a bounty. So, despite the Gracchi brothers being descendants of Scipio Africanus, they really pissed off the Senate. So the main thing you need to know is just really which brother came first. You got Tiberius and then Gaius. They both did land reform stuff. Gaius just did a lot more. And while he met a similar fate, it was just on a much larger scale. And the reason I'm bringing these two up is the reforms that they're attempting end up creating a ripple effect in the rather unstable Roman Republic. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Here again is the guy's about to get shanked. I mean, this dude's got a freaking rock. He couldn't afford a sword, so he's just going to bash someone's head in. As you can see here, though, they'd rather die their own hand than get beat to death by a mob, which, to be fair, would be an easier way to go. So the Gracchi brothers lead pretty directly into this next section, which creates it's really a domino effect, because after these guys, we're leading up to the end of the Republic. So you've got Jugurtha, a king in North Africa. He was known for being just really corrupt. He came to power through deceit and murder, had realized that Rome was not happy with him, sent agents to the Senate to bribe them to not come and get him. In the year 111, an army was sent to North Africa to get him. He bribed the consul to leave. Eventually, he did have to go to Rome, but bribed a tribune to escape, and while he was there, a rival to the throne was murdered on his behest. So yeah, Jugurtha was just really corrupt and was able to just bribe everybody around him because they were corrupt too. I mean, it's hard to say, well, this dude was corrupt. He bribed everybody. It's like, well, if they took the bribes, they were corrupt as well. And so he was on the run from Roman captors for the next 5 years, which, again, directly leads into this next section of things just, like, immediately falling apart. So here is Jugurtha, with, I guess, one of his rivals being captured and brought in to probably be killed. Do I have a... No, I don't. Okay. So it's in this that the next group appears. So Jugurtha is on the run. As we mentioned with consuls, one of them typically led the armies, the other stayed home and did important senatorial work, which was all well and good because if a consul was out being a general and won battles, they would win glory, as well as lots of money for themselves and their men. Again, though, as we're getting to the late Republic, with wars not really being a thing anymore, the consuls had to use a way to use their position to, well, make money and power for themselves. So we have Gaius Marius. He's the first of these guys that's very important. He wasn't a commoner, but he wasn't really a patrician either. He did, however, become consul in the continuing war with Jugurtha. So again, we're in the middle of all of that. So, as I mentioned, in addition to the glory of winning, you also got to take loot, or the majority of the loot from your enemy after a victory. And this was the guy that I mentioned in the previous chapter who used the clientage system to bind entire legions to his side. So that 5,000 to 6,000 man military unit was now loyal specifically to Gaius Marius, which means he could technically do a civil war if he wanted. Luckily, he didn't, but he does still cause some issues. Eventually, his troops did capture Jugurtha, but because Marius had so many dudes under his control, he wasn't personally there when Jugurtha was captured. So one of his representatives, a man named Sulla, used this opportunity and took credit for Jugurtha's capture. And boy, this would cause issues. Also, Gaius was elected consul 5 times in a row, which was very much illegal because, as we've mentioned at the beginning of the previous chapter, you were consul for 1 year and then you were done. Gaius had been consul for 5 years in a row. Because by this point, people had been consuls more than once, but usually they would be consul, and then someone else would get elected, and a few years later they would run for consul again. Because again, with 1 year terms, it was easier to just like come back and do it again. Well, Gaius wasn't really following the rules, which is going to be a theme. So there is, I'm assuming that's Sulla, after they captured Jugurtha, which leads to issues. So again, going back to the Gracchi brothers, one of Gaius's ideas was to give the Latin allies citizenship. Well, Rome told them that wasn't going to be a thing, so they had themselves a lovely little war. Marius was sent to fight the Italian allies, former allies, I suppose. However, didn't do a very good job. Sulla did a bit better, but finally the Senate simply acquiesced to the demands of the rebels and allowed them to become Roman citizens. Because being under Rome and being a Roman citizen were two different things, and you definitely wanted the latter. The reason that they ended, well, part of the reason why they wanted to end the war as quickly as possible was because there was another war happening. Italia had called upon Mithridates VI, who had convinced Greece to also rebel, and Rome was like, okay, you know what, Italians, fine, you can be Romans now. We got to go deal with Greece. So Sulla went out to fight Mithridates, but Gaius called him back because, well, he knew that Sulla was going to try to steal glory again. So, rather than simply come back and do what he was told, Sulla marched his army on Rome, which you didn't do. This would be like a general of the military marching his army, including tanks and everything, through the middle of D.C. You don't do that. So citizens responded by hurling rocks and such at the army from rooftops because you weren't supposed to come into Rome with your army. So Sulla responded by burning down Rome. Marius fled because, well, Sulla had an army with him. Sulla restored order, went east, the people revolted again, Marius came back, was elected consul again, then was killed after, quote, imposing a reign of terror, so I'm assuming killing more civilians. Meanwhile, Sulla defeated Mithridates and regained Greece for Rome. So there's a lot going on here, but the end result is that, for one, Sulla marched into Rome. Marius eventually came back, became consul, and then was murdered because he wasn't doing a very good job, and Sulla's still around. So here is Sulla fighting his way into Rome, which again is Roman on Roman violence. Let's go. There we are. So Sulla comes back. Cinna, who was Marius' co-consul, was also assassinated, so there was no consuls left in Rome when Sulla arrived. He came in with his army again, declared that he was liberating Rome from, their dead consuls, and took the title of dictator by force, which was also something you were supposed to do. That you were voted into dictator during a crisis, and the crisis was Sulla. So he used the unquestioned power of dictator to murder his enemies. At one point, a senator pleaded with Sulla, asking him to end the uncertainty of who would live and die. So Sulla was like, you know what? you're right, I will end this uncertainty. Here's a list of people I'm going to kill. 40 senators, 1,600 equestrians, most of whom were supporters of Gaius Marius. And then once all his enemies were killed, he abolished all the Gracchi reforms and then retired, which is one of the weirder fates of a Roman dictator. Most of them were just murdered. But no, he got rid of all these reforms, killed all his enemies, and then just like, all right, I'm done being dictator. You guys can go back to doing what you're doing. So here he is marching into Rome a second time. So, while the Roman Republic still technically exists, it is very much on its last legs. And this leads to what the book calls the Strivers. These folks that were also kind of involved with everything that was going on and attempted to run Rome after Sulla did his thing. So we have Pompey. He was part of Sulla's forces, and his main claim to fame was that he was good at being where he needed to be when he needed to be there. The main thing was that he was there to help finish off Spartacus' slave rebellion, which, if you're not familiar with Spartacus, that's the whole thing. He was a slave forced to fight as a gladiator. However, when you get a bunch of ripped dudes together and train them to fight, they tend to be good at fighting. So Spartacus and his fellow gladiator slaves broke free of a training camp, gathered up more slaves, and soon had this huge army. They defeated 9 Roman armies over the course of 2 years, which I don't know exactly what consists of an army. I'm pretty sure it's more than a single legion. So that's like thousands of Romans they're defeating. So then we had Crassus, who was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, so he just could buy legions. Went in with 6 legions and managed to crush the majority of the uprising. Those who escaped, again, were caught by Pompey because Pompey just happened to show up in the right place at the right time. And both of them were made consul in 70 BCE. Oh yes, and the slaves that were captured were crucified in the thousands along the road to Rome. So you just go down the road and there'd be dudes on both sides of the road strung up on crosses. In various states of decomposure, I'm sure. So they sent Pompey out to fight Mithridates, because Mithridates is still causing trouble. Mithridates decides that he doesn't want to be captured by the Romans, so he kills his family and himself rather than be captured. Because, as you can see, the Romans weren't real good on mercy. So Pompey extended Rome's holdings all the way to the Euphrates River, which further increased Rome's wealth. So while Pompey was best for just being there at the right time, he didn't really even fight Mithridates. Mithridates decided he wasn't going to be there for it. But since they had an army, he just was like, all right, we're going to go all the way till we find a river, and then we're just going to claim all that for Rome. We will come back to Pompey and Crassus in just a moment, but they are at the time consuls. And then we have Cicero and Catiline. Cicero was of the equestrian lineage, so again, he wasn't quite a patrician, but he was still above a plebeian. He was this master orator who our founding fathers were really super into. A lot of the founding fathers, whenever they would write their letters to each other, they would have a pen name based off of some Greek or Roman guy like this. One of them called it, I think it might have been Jefferson that called himself Cicero. They were huge nerds. Sometimes they would even write to each other in Latin or ancient Greek just to like flex on how good they were at being classical history nerds. Yeah, the founding fathers were dorks. So let's see. Cicero was elected consul in 63 BCE, defeating Catiline, who was a patrician. Catiline didn't take it very well, so after Cicero beat him again, which, just to remind you guys, you're not supposed to be a consul more than once, but at this point, apparently nobody cares. Cicero decided that he was going to murder the consuls and take control of Rome, because that's a stable way of handling being beaten in an election. Cicero, though, was not just a master orator. He had a spy network. They found out what Catiline was up to. They told the Senate. Meanwhile, an army was sent out to get rid of Catiline and his supporters. So, yeah, the main thing about this, despite, again, Cicero being a really important dude in, like, Roman history, is that this just shows how shaky things were in the Republic. Aristocrats felt like their power was being taken, and they were willing to overthrow the government to gain wealth and power. Like, it was getting not great. Here is Cicero. Oh, I don't think Catiline got a. I don't think Catiline got a statue. Okay. Now, the meat of the chapter. Caesar. So they formed this so-called Caesarian, well, really consular faction. It was called the Caesarian faction later because obviously Caesar was the most important. At the time, he was just a dude. So they formed this faction between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So the two previous consuls we talked about, and also Caesar, who was, well, I said he was just a dude. He was like this really well-liked general among the people. He's real famous for his campaigns into Gaul. And the idea was that if one of them became a consul, they would use that position to help the others. So since there's three of them, you've got a three-person shot that somebody's going to make it to consul, whereas they would then strengthen their faction and help each other out. Now, Caesar was mostly known as being a general, but he was already pretty savvy when it came to politics. He used gladiatorial games and free grain to gain support among the people, which meant that the Senate didn't have as much control over him, because if the people support you, you don't really need the Senate's approval. So he became consul in 59, and decided he was just going to go off and do his own thing, because again, he's a really good general. So he used the whole one consul goes out and does general stuff pretty much exclusively. Also, while he was consul, he decided he was going to give himself a longer term, which wasn't something you're supposed to be able to do, but whatever. The people approved and let him do his thing. So he went off to Gaul, carved out a bunch of territory for Rome, and then, of course, became very famous while doing that. While he was gone, Pompey and Crassus both became consuls, and during this time, Pompey took some land in Spain, while Crassus lost 7 legions and his life over in Syria. don't remember if this is. I'm pretty sure this is a what's the apocryphal report. I don't know if this is exact. This is not confirmed as to having happened, is what I'm trying to say. But supposedly the way Crassus was killed, due to him being one of the most wealthy men in Rome, after his armies were wiped out and he was captured, whoever it was in Syria they were fighting, poured molten gold down his throat, which will kill you. Again, we don't have a ton of proof of that, but that's like the popular depiction is Crassus, being extremely rich, was killed by having molten gold poured down his throat. And I mean, I'm just saying, I've heard that brought up a lot more in recent days, about certain extremely wealthy people who are almost no longer human in the way they treat everybody else. So I'm just saying. So yeah, here is the consular faction. You've got Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Now it says the first triumvirate here, but the book is really specific about triumvirates being official things. So this was like an unofficial triumvirate. And a triumvirate is simply three dudes working together to gain power in Rome. That's what all that means. It's a big fancy Latin word. Here is some of the stuff that Caesar took in Gaul. He did a lot of really famous conquests in Gaul, one of which is always my favorite to recount because it's just so ballsy, but it worked. Caesar and his army were besieging a Gallic fort, or a city, I guess. And when it comes to sieges, it's not like where you're trying to break down the wall and get in. You're just keeping the people from getting out and keeping food from getting in until the people essentially give up. But at the same time, your army is pretty much static as well, so you also have the chance of running out of food, and also all these people all together in one place tend to spread disease. So it's sort of it's an endurance test of who's going to outlast the other. Is the city going to make it, or will the besiegers actually make it? Because the besiegers could at least get people to go out and like get supplies and come back. However, while Caesar was besieging this city, on the horizon, his scouts spotted allies of the city coming to break the siege. Because obviously, if you're fighting an army outside a city wall, you can't really keep the guys in the city from breaking out and hitting you in the flank. So what Caesar did, or actually most of the times when a siege is broken like that, the besiegers simply either retreat or face the army that's fighting them, and the city's able to recover. Caesar instead built fortifications around his siege camp, so he essentially was being besieged by these allies of the city while besieging the city. I've never heard this done before or since, but Caesar managed to both defend himself from these guys coming in and take over the city. He's well known for a reason, besides just what he ends up doing in Rome. And, I mean, this is part of the reason why he was able to do all this in Rome, because the people loved him. He was this great war hero. All that said, well, Roman's gonna Rome, and with Crassus dead now, Caesar and Pompey are the only ones left, and rather than getting along, they now oppose each other. I think the book mentions it this way. Or no, maybe it was a different book that I read. But basically, the triumvirates were like a three-legged stool, where as long as you got all three legs, it's stable. But once you lose one, it collapses. This was the case. With Crassus gone, you now have Caesar and Pompey on opposing sides. In 52, the Senate elected only Pompey as consul, which again wasn't something that normally was done. And tried to limit Caesar's power, and then sent 2 legions out to arrest Caesar in 49 because they knew Caesar had too much power and they were worried about what he was going to do. They weren't arresting him for necessarily doing anything, they just were trying to take him down before he did anything. Well, Caesar, apparently knowing what was going on, marched his army into Rome. The Rubicon River was the border between Gaul and Italy. Once he marched his army across the Rubicon, this was the beginning of the Civil War. Because, again, technically, you're not supposed to bring your army into Rome. Apparently, not even supposed to bring an active army into Italy. And crossing the Rubicon, which is a term we still use today, where it's no turning back. Once he crossed the Rubicon with his army, that was it. The war was on. So Pompey and the Senate bravely ran away, and Caesar rolled into Rome and occupied the city. At least he didn't burn it down like Sulla did. So finally, Caesar made his way to Greece, and in July of 48 defeated the force of Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. You don't need to worry about the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey then escaped again, made his way to Egypt, and the Egyptian authority there greeted him by taking his head off, which they saved for Caesar. They pickled it and made sure that it was there to present when Caesar finally showed up. So there's Caesar crossing the Rubicon. For some reason, I've got it twice. I've never gone in and actually fixed that, but don't worry about it. All right. Hold on, let's go back real quick. This is 48. Caesar spent a couple of years in Egypt, very likely creating unofficial heirs with Cleopatra, and then made his way back to Rome, having been named dictator for 10 years. And he's like, 10 years is great and all, but how about for life? Why not? He also named himself Pontifex Maximus, which is the high priest, a tribune, and a consul. Basically, he was all the highest offices in Rome. Usually dictator means you're in control of everything anyway, but now he's like, I'm going to have my hands in everything, period. A lot of people, of course, accused him of being a king, because, that's what he was doing. But he stated, I am not king, I am Caesar. And from this point on, Caesar is less of a name and more of a title. For example, the Tsar in Tsarist Russia, that is simply Russian for Caesar. What was the other one? It was the German leaders back when Germany still had an empire. I can't remember the word for some reason. Kaiser. That also that's just like Germanic for Caesar. So they use this title, the name, as a title, which we're going to see here in just a minute too. Revamped many issues in Rome. Gave land to soldiers in Gaul, which was the thing that the Gracchi brothers were trying to do. Also created a new calendar system. He's the reason we have July, because Julius Caesar. He literally named a month after him. And due to him and another dude, that's why months like October aren't the 8th month, because oct means 8th, or 8 in Latin. But because of this dude and his I'm going to say predecessor, his successor, they just decided to name months after themselves and completely screwed up the calendar for us. Because, again, like December, Dec, that's 10, but it's the 12th month because these guys. So March 15th, 44 BC, he by himself was stabbed to death in the Senate, on the Senate floor, by a group of men, including his former ally, Brutus. He was stabbed something like 44 times. Each person that was part of the conspiracy had to get blood on their hands, or they'd be seen as a traitor. So, like, they went in and everybody got a knife in. Also, the Ides of March is this Roman holiday, which is seen as sort of a bad omen. And supposedly, at least in the Shakespearean play about this, supposedly he was warned by like an oracle or something, but didn't take her word for it and ends up dying. One of Caesar's loyalists, Mark Antony, was not informed of the plot, so when he heard that Caesar had been shanked on the Senate floor, he wasn't too happy about it. Also, I found this image relatively recently, and I had to include it. Your classic Caesar. Actually, I think this came with a caption. And like one of the people in the comments was like, "I don't get it," and then everybody else was like, "Don't tell them, let them figure it out." Anyway, here's Caesar being handed his resignation form. Like, this wasn't a group of, thugs in the street. These were the Roman senators on the floor of the Senate. See, do I have? Yeah, no, I'll take a step back. After this, they paraded around the streets of Rome with their bloody knives, like declaring that, the dictator was dead and that Rome was free, having not realized that most people in Rome liked Caesar. So they quickly had to flee the city before just like the random populace tore them apart. So Mark Antony came in. He was appointed leader, whatever the term of the role is now. Made Caesar's reforms legitimate because, again, Caesar was just this dictator and everything else. So they weren't entirely sure what to do with it. He tried to have his assassins forgiven to try to restore peace more quickly. Cicero, though, being the loudmouth that he was publicly denouncing Mark Antony and had to get out of Rome. So Cicero ends up getting killed. Well, yeah. Cicero ends up getting killed. But before we get to that, Octavian, who was Caesar's nephew and adopted son because of the whole clientage thing, also came into Rome with an army when the Senate would not make him consul. And the Senate decided that, you're here with an army like you're not supposed to be, but that army is really convincing, so you can be a consul now. So we've got Mark Antony, Octavian, and now a third member of the triumvirate, a man named Lepidus, who was a former governor of Spain. He was just sort of sure he was, he had some background in ruling, but compared to these two, he was just some dude. This was the first official triumvirate as it was recognized by the Senate and given official powers. And the main thing that they needed to do was to get rid of enemies of the state, which is to say the people that shanked Caesar and also Cicero. So Mark Antony's attempt to bring everybody back into the fold and not have a drawn-out conflict didn't work out. So once Caesar's killers were, killed, the triumvirate, instead of all three ruling from Rome, split the empire into three parts, and each ruled a separate section. Lepidus has Africa, which is to say mostly Spain and the northern Africa section there in the west. Mark Antony was given the east, which is to say Egypt, which is going to come back to bite him. And then Octavian was given, Italy. So, despite them supposedly being of equal authority, Octavian was clearly the one in charge. So here again we have the official triumvirate. You've got, I believe this was Mark Antony. No, this was Octavian. Octavian and Mark Antony. Lepidus only has a coin. He never got a bust made of himself. So this leads, everything is running so close together now compared to where we've been. This leads to the triumvirate falling apart. Mark Antony forced Lepidus to retire, which, to be fair, once again, like with Sulla, that ain't a bad way to go. Hey, you're no longer in power. Neat. It's a whole lot better than the way Caesar got retired. And Octavian wanted to get rid of Mark Antony because despite Octavian having familial ties to Caesar, Mark Antony was still seen very positively in the public because he was the first one to come in and restore order after Caesar was killed. However, Mark Antony being down in Egypt, he became involved with Cleopatra, and at least according to Octavian's propaganda, had fallen under the spell of this foreign royalty. As I've mentioned, Cleopatra was more Greek than she was Egyptian in terms of ethnicity, but that was still too foreign for the upstanding Roman citizens. So eventually, Octavian and Antony had a battle off the coast of Actium, where Mark Antony was defeated. He fled back to Egypt, where both he and Cleopatra committed suicide, rather than have Octavian come and torture them to death. Supposedly, Cleopatra, shut herself in a room with poisonous snakes. But again, that's kind of apocryphal. We're not entirely sure how it happened. But they both definitely ended themselves before Octavian got there. And once again, Shakespeare really liked this period, as he wrote a play on Antony and Cleopatra, which then became a movie based on the quality there. It looks like the 60s or 70s. Although these things were long. If you've ever seen, what's the name of the really long movie? I think it might have just been called Exodus. It was based on, Moses in Egypt and then leading the Israelites out of Egypt. That thing's 3 hours long. But that was this period of movie making where they would just make these long ass like epics, really. That were almost more like Shakespearean stage plays just put to film. And I accidentally have that twice. But yeah. So the Republic's dying. After all of this, all the norms and laws and just things that kept the Republic stable are in shambles. People wanted peace, and Octavian could provide that, even though he was going to be very heavy-handed. Ordered the empire to a rigid controlled structure, so now Rome is officially an empire. I mean, I guess you could say it was under Caesar, but he wasn't technically emperor, nor was Mark Antony. But once you get to Octavian, who eventually names himself Augustus, because of his auctoritas, or authority, over the state, which again, that's why we have August. Thank you, Augustus. You ruined the calendar. He created the Praetorian Guard, which was the emperor's personal bodyguard, because, well, as we've seen, a lot of these dudes end up getting killed. Ironically, the Praetorian Guard ends up being, I can't say the most common killer of emperors, but a lot of times the Praetorian Guard ends up killing the emperor, because they're the ones that are closest to him, and when the public is really tired of the emperor, it's just really easy for them to stick a knife at him. Now he, on paper, restored the Senate and Republic, but really he made himself emperor, and the Senate existed as a portion of his power, because the Senate continues to exist throughout the Roman Empire. That's like a major part of Rome, even as it's an empire, is that the Senate's still there. The Senate still has a lot of power, but the emperor's in charge. And specifically, he made sure that the Senate legitimized all of his changes, because, well, he was going to be the big power in Rome. So here we have Augustus in his, imperial dress, and he's got this creepy-ass little cherub baby over here, which implies he has, like, connection to divinity. Here's the Praetorian Guard. Again, elite Roman soldiers, handpicked to keep the emperor from getting killed, although, again, they often did the opposite. Okay, I got through a lot of this chapter. So, we're going to end this here, because, well, Augustus is a good place to end. And then we'll get into really how the empire conducted itself, and the later emperors who were really bad. So yeah, we'll do that next week. Today is Wednesday, isn't it? Yeah, we'll do that on Monday.